The roots of retribution. The morning sun filtered through the gnarled branches of the apple tree outside Daniel Harper's bedroom window, casting dappled golden patterns across the hardwood floor. He stirred awake, the familiar creak of the old house settling around him like a comforting embrace. At 62, Daniel had grown accustomed to the slow rhythm of retirement. Early mornings with a cup of coffee, the scent of earth and fruit wafting from his backyard, and the quiet satisfaction of tending to the orchard that had been his family's pride for generations. That morning, though, something felt off. The air carried an unfamiliar hum, a low vibration that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and sat up, his graying hair tousled from the pillow. The hum grew louder, morphing into a guttural roar that sent a jolt through his chest. Chainsaws. Not the distant buzz of a neighbor trimming a hedge, but a deep, menacing sound that made his stomach twist. He threw off the blankets and stumbled to the window, still half convinced he was caught in some lingering dream. The sight that greeted him snapped him awake like a bucket of ice water. Men in neon vests swarmed his backyard, their chainsaws slicing through the air with mechanical precision. Daniel's orchard, his sanctuary, was under attack. A towering apple tree, planted by his grandfather over 50 years ago, shuddered as a blade bit into its trunk. The crack of splintering wood echoed like a gunshot, and the tree groaned before crashing to the ground in a chaotic spray of branches and crushed apples. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a dream. This was a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. He tore down the stairs, his bare feet pounding against the worn steps, and flung open the back door. The cold morning air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. His heart raced as he sprinted across the dew-soaked grass toward the chaos. Sawdust clouded the air, the sharp scent of freshly cut wood mingling with the sour tang of ruined fruit. Another tree fell, a peach tree this time, one that had won him a blue ribbon at the state fair a decade ago. The workers moved with ruthless efficiency, oblivious to the history they were destroying. And there, standing in the middle of it all, was Laura Grayson. She was a petite woman in her late 50s, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her arms crossed over a crisp blazer that screamed authority. A smirk played on her lips, the kind of self-satisfied expression that made Daniel's blood boil. She didn't flinch as a cherry tree, the oldest in his orchard, grafted from a lineage that stretched back a century, toppled with a sickening thud. She didn't even glance at the wreckage. Her eyes were fixed on him, gleaming with triumph. "Oh, good. You're awake," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Daniel stopped short, his fists clenching at his sides. He couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to match the rage surging through him. His orchard, his family's legacy, was being hacked apart before his eyes, and Laura Grayson was standing there like she'd just done him a favor. "You're welcome," she added, tilting her head as if she'd just swept his porch instead of orchestrating an act of pure devastation. "Now your yard won't be such an eyesore." The world tilted around him. An eyesore? Those trees weren't just plants. They were history, memory, life. The apple tree had been planted the day his father brought him home from the hospital. The peach tree had shaded his childhood summers. The cherry tree had been his grandfather's pride, a survivor of storms and droughts that had outlasted everything but this. And now they were gone, reduced to stumps and sawdust at the whim of a woman who saw nothing but a rulebook where Daniel saw a lifetime. He took a step toward her, his voice finally breaking free. "You had no right." Laura held up a piece of paper, waving it like a trophy. "Oh, but I did. Section 5B of the HOA agreement clearly states that any landscaping disrupting the visual cohesion of the community is subject to removal." "You should have read the fine print, Daniel." "That's not what it says," he shot back, his voice trembling with fury. "You can't just—" "The HOA board voted on it," she interrupted, her smirk widening. "And since I run the board, it's all perfectly legal." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She hadn't just acted on a whim. She'd planned this, gone behind his back, rallied her little clique of followers to sign off on this destruction. All because she couldn't stand the sight of his orchard thriving outside her control. He looked past her at the carnage, the broken branches, the crushed fruit, the stumps where his trees had stood tall just hours ago. His gaze landed on the cherry tree, its gnarled trunk now a jagged ruin. That tree had survived a fire in '68, a drought in '92, and countless storms. It hadn't survived Laura Grayson. "This isn't over," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Oh, please. You don't have a leg to stand on. It's done." But as the last tree crashed to the ground and the chainsaws fell silent, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, burning hot and bright, but it was sharpening into something else: focus, resolve. Laura thought she'd won. She thought she could destroy his family's legacy and walk away unscathed. She had no idea what she'd just unleashed. Daniel hadn't always lived in Willow Creek. 3 years ago, he'd sold his cramped city apartment and moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood, drawn by the promise of peace and a good-sized lot for his orchard. Retirement had loomed like a blank page, and he'd filled it with plans to tend the trees his family had nurtured for generations. The house itself was modest, a two-story fixer-upper with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but the yard was a dream. Nearly an acre of fertile soil, perfect for the apple, peach, and cherry trees he'd brought with him, each one carefully transplanted from his father's old property. The orchard wasn't just a hobby. It was a lifeline to his past. His grandfather, Elias Harper, had been a farmer with dirt under his nails and a quiet pride in his work. He'd planted the cherry tree in 1920, grafting it from a strain prized for its rich, dark fruit. Daniel's father, Thomas, had added the apple tree in '62, the year Daniel was born, and the peach tree a few years later. Over the decades, those trees had borne fruit that won awards, graced magazine pages, and earned praise from chefs across the state. They were more than trees. They were the Harper family, rooted deep in the earth. Willow Creek had seemed like the perfect place to carry on that legacy. The neighbors were friendly enough, waving from their manicured lawns as he unloaded boxes and saplings. For the first few months, Daniel settled into a routine. Coffee on the porch, pruning in the afternoon, and evenings spent sketching plans for a small fruit stand. He'd even started entering local fairs again, his apples and peaches racking up ribbons like old times. Then Laura Grayson knocked on his door. It was a sunny afternoon in early spring, the kind where the air smells like fresh grass and possibility. Daniel had been kneeling in the dirt, planting a new row of saplings, when he heard the sharp rap of knuckles against wood. He wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door to find Laura standing there, clipboard in hand, her smile as stiff as her starched blouse. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, her voice too bright, too practiced. "I'm Laura Grayson, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Just a few things to go over about our HOA rules." Daniel had nodded politely, expecting a quick rundown of trash pickup days or noise ordinances. Instead, Laura launched into a lecture about community standards. His fence was too rustic, she said, eyeing the weathered wood he'd salvaged from his father's barn. His garden gnomes, a quirky collection he'd inherited from his mother, were unacceptable. And his mailbox, a simple black box on a post, wasn't aesthetically cohesive with the sleek, modern designs lining the street. He'd laughed it off at first. "I'll think about it," he'd said, closing the door before she could hand him the stack of papers she'd brought. But as he watched her stride back to her pristine house across the street, he caught the glint in her eyes, a predator sizing up its prey. He should have known then that Laura Grayson didn't see a home when she looked at his property. She saw a battlefield. Daniel Harper leaned against the weathered fence that bordered his orchard, a mug of coffee warming his hands as the sun dipped below the horizon. The evening air carried the faint sweetness of ripening apples, a scent that usually calmed him. But tonight, it did little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. 3 months had passed since Laura Grayson's first visit, and what had started as a petty nuisance had grown into a relentless campaign. The woman was a force of nature, unyielding, meticulous, and utterly infuriating. It began with the letters. They arrived in crisp white envelopes, stamped with the Willow Creek HOA logo, each one more absurd than the last. The first complained about the overgrown nature of his yard, citing vague bylaws about maintaining a tidy appearance. Daniel had chuckled, tossing it into a drawer with unpaid bills. His orchard wasn't overgrown. It was alive, thriving, a patchwork of green leaves and vibrant fruit that stood out against the sterile lawns of the neighborhood. But Laura didn't see life. She saw disorder. The second letter came a week later, this time with a $50 fine for non-regulation plant life. Then a $100 penalty for excessive foliage. Daniel ignored them, figuring they'd stop when she realized he wasn't playing her game. He was wrong. The fines kept coming, piling up like leaves in autumn, each one a little more outrageous. One even claimed his cherry tree cast unauthorized shadows onto the street. He'd laughed out loud at that one, showing it to his neighbor, Tom Ellis, over a beer on the porch. "She's unhinged," Tom had said, shaking his head. A retired mechanic with a grizzled beard, Tom lived 2 houses down and had his own run-ins with Laura, mostly over his vintage truck, which she deemed an eyesore. "She's been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for years. Most folks just pay the fines to shut her up." "I'm not most folks," Daniel replied, his jaw tightening. He'd spent his life building things, first as a carpenter, then as a keeper of his family's orchard. He wasn't about to let some clipboard-wielding tyrant tear it down. The letters were just the beginning. Laura started showing up unannounced, her heels clicking on his gravel driveway as she inspected his property like a health inspector at a greasy diner. She'd take photos with her phone, scribbling notes on that damned clipboard, her lips pursed in disapproval. Once, he caught her standing at the edge of his yard, scowling at the apple tree he'd nicknamed Big Red for its ruby fruit. "That tree's an eyesore," she'd said, hands on her hips. Daniel had grinned, leaning on his rake. "That tree's older than your HOA. Probably worth more, too." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she'd stormed off, leaving him with a sinking feeling that this was far from over. Word got around the neighborhood. Tom's wife, Ellen, told him Laura had complained about him at the last HOA meeting, calling his orchard a disruption to community harmony. A few neighbors laughed about it, and Daniel took to jokingly calling the apple tree Laura when he pruned it. The name stuck, and soon half the street was chuckling about old Laura shading the sidewalk. Laura didn't find it funny. Daniel saw it in the way her smile tightened whenever they crossed paths, the way her gaze lingered on his trees like she was plotting their demise. He tried to ignore her, focusing instead on the harvest. The apples were coming in strong that year, their skins glossy and tart, perfect for the pies he donated to the local fair. The peaches were plump, their juice staining his fingers as he packed them into crates. And the cherries, God, the cherries, were dark and rich, the kind that made people close their eyes when they bit into them. He'd entered them in a regional competition, and the judges had raved, hinting at a feature in Farm Vaughfield magazine. But every triumph seemed to fuel Laura's resentment. One afternoon, as Daniel hauled a basket of peaches to his porch, he spotted her across the street, talking loudly to Mrs. Carter, an elderly widow who nodded along like a bobblehead. Laura gestured toward his yard, her voice carrying on the breeze. "An absolute mess, dragging down property values." Mrs. Carter glanced at Daniel, her eyes apologetic, but she didn't contradict Laura. No one did. Not out loud, anyway. That night, Tom and Ellen stopped by with a six-pack and a warning. "She's ramping up," Ellen said, her voice low as they sat on Daniel's porch. "Heard she's pushing for a vote at the next HOA meeting. Something about corrective action for your trees." Daniel cracked open a beer, his knuckles white around the can. "She can't do that. It's my land." "She thinks she can," Tom said. "She's got the board wrapped around her finger. Half of them are scared of her, the other half owe her favors. You need to fight this, Dan." "I'm not bowing to her," Daniel said, his voice firm. "She wants a war? She'll get one." The next day, he dug out the HOA handbook, a dusty pamphlet he'd barely glanced at when he moved in. Section 5B was there, just as Laura had claimed. Landscaping deemed disruptive to the visual cohesion of the community may be subject to removal at the discretion of the board. The wording was vague, a loophole wide enough to drive a tractor through. He cursed under his breath, realizing she might actually have the power to make good on her threats. Still, he refused to bend. He skipped the fines, ignored the letters, and kept tending his orchard. The neighbors watched, some with quiet admiration, others with nervous glances toward Laura's house. Tom and Ellen became his unofficial allies, slipping him updates from HOA gossip. Mrs. Carter left a plate of cookies on his porch one night, a silent apology for not speaking up. Even Jake, the teenage kid who mowed lawns down the street, started lingering by the fence, asking questions about the trees like they were something special. "They're not just trees," Daniel told him once, handing him a peach. "They're stories. This one's my dad's. That one's my granddad's. They've been around longer than most folks here." Jake took a bite, juice dripping down his chin. "That's cool. Mrs. Grayson says they're ugly, but I think they're awesome." Daniel smiled, but the compliment didn't ease the growing dread. Laura wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was doubling down, her shadow stretching longer with every passing day. He knew it was only a matter of time before she struck, and when she did, it wouldn't be with a letter or a fine. It would be something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. The morning of the attack dawned clear and crisp, the kind of day Daniel usually spent pruning or picking fruit. He'd been up late the night before, sorting cherries for the competition, and had overslept, a rarity for him. The roar of chainsaws jolted him awake, and by the time he reached the backyard, the destruction was already underway. The workers moved like a swarm of locusts, their neon vests flashing in the sunlight as they carved through his orchard. Big Red, the apple tree, was the first to fall, its trunk splitting with a sound that echoed in Daniel's bones. He stood frozen for a moment, watching as the peach tree followed, its branches snapping like brittle bones. The cherry tree, the one his grandfather had grafted with trembling hands, went down last, its dark fruit spilling across the grass like blood. Laura stood at the center of it all, her arms crossed, her smirk a blade of its own. "You're welcome," she said, as if she'd just mowed his lawn instead of gutting his soul. Daniel's voice shook as he confronted her. "You had no right." She waved the HOA paper, her confidence unshaken. The board voted. "It's done." He wanted to scream, to grab the chainsaw from the nearest worker and turn it on her precious rules. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "This isn't over." The workers paused, sensing the tension. One of them, a burly man with a scruffy beard, approached Daniel, his expression uneasy. "Sir, we were just following orders." She said it was all approved. Daniel turned to Laura. "You signed off on this personally, didn't you?" "Of course," she replied, her smirk widening. "It's my responsibility to ensure compliance." He pulled out his phone, snapping photos of the wreckage, the stumps, the crushed fruit, the sawdust swirling in the air. "Hope you have a good lawyer," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Because you just destroyed an orchard under review for historical preservation." Laura's smile faltered, just for a second. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That cherry tree? Oldest documented lineage in the region. The apples? Heirloom varieties you can't find anywhere else. The peaches? Worth a fortune. And you had no legal right to touch them without a hearing." She huffed, clinging to her authority. "The board. I'll be requesting those meeting minutes," he cut in. "Let's see how official this vote really was." For the first time, Laura looked unsure. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her mind racing for a defense. Daniel didn't give her the chance to find one. "I'm suing you, Laura. The HOA, too. Trespassing, vandalism, financial damages. Hope you're ready for the bill." Her face flushed red, but she recovered quickly. "This isn't over," she snapped. He smiled, a slow, cold smile. "I know, but I'm the one who's going to win." As he walked back to the house, stepping over the broken branches and shattered fruit, the anger burned hotter than ever. But it was focused now, a weapon he could wield. Laura had taken his orchard, his history, his heart. He'd make sure she paid for every last splinter. The weeks after the massacre were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Daniel hired a lawyer named Sarah Bennett, a sharp-tongued woman with a reputation for dismantling HOA overreach. She pored over the photos, the HOA handbook, and the preservation application he'd filed months ago with the state agricultural department. "They messed up big," she said, grinning. "This is a slam dunk." Daniel threw himself into the fight, gathering evidence like a man possessed. He tracked down old fair ribbons, magazine clippings, and letters from chefs praising his fruit. He contacted the state, confirming the orchard's pending heritage status. Every night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the empty backyard through the window, the stumps a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd make Laura pay for. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the chaos of that morning. Daniel sat calmly, watching as Sarah laid out the case. Unauthorized destruction of private property, violation of state preservation laws, financial damages totaling hundreds of thousands. She presented expert evaluations, arborists who valued the trees, historians who testified to their significance. The cherry tree alone, they said, was priceless, a living artifact of regional agriculture. Laura's defense was flimsy. Her lawyer argued the HOA acted in good faith, that the orchard was a visual nuisance. But when Laura took the stand, she couldn't resist digging her own grave. "We did what needed to be done," she snapped at the judge, her composure cracking. He was stubborn. The judge's questions were merciless. "Did you consult a legal expert? Provide notice? Verify the tree's status?" Laura's silence was damning. The ruling came swiftly. The HOA was guilty, Laura personally liable alongside it. The damages were staggering, enough to cover the orchard's value, lost revenue, and punitive fines. Laura turned pale, her hands clenched in her lap. As Daniel passed her on his way out, he leaned in. "Hope you didn't have big vacation plans. You're going to need every penny." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her defeat was written in the slump of her shoulders, the tremble of her jaw. The money from the lawsuit burned a hole in Daniel's pocket, but he knew exactly how to spend it. The vacant lot next to Laura's house had sat unsold for months, its price slashed after the HOA's reputation tanked. He bought it the day after the verdict, a grin spreading across his face as the realtor handed him the keys. He hired a team of landscapers, and over the next few weeks, they transformed the lot into a new orchard, bigger, bolder, more defiant than the last. Apple trees framed Laura's house, their branches brushing her windows. Peach trees blocked her view of the street. Cherry trees towered over her pristine lawn, a living monument to her failure. Every spade of dirt felt like a victory. Laura watched from her porch, her face a mask of fury. When the news crew showed up, drawn by the story of the HOA's downfall and Daniel's comeback, she stormed out, ready to yell. But the cameras stopped her cold. She retreated, blinds snapping shut, as Daniel waved to the reporters with a basket of fresh fruit. He threw a grand opening party, inviting the whole neighborhood. Music floated over the rows of saplings, laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. Tom and Ellen brought a cooler of beer. Mrs. Carter baked cookies, and Jake helped pass out apples. Laura stayed inside, her absence louder than any protest. The neighbors thanked him, their voices soft with relief. "She ruled us for years," Tom said, biting into a peach. "You broke her." Daniel watched the sun set over his new trees, their blossoms glowing gold. "I didn't just break her. I buried her." Months later, Laura sold her house and left Willow Creek, her tail between her legs. No one waved goodbye. The HOA, stripped of its power, became a shadow of itself, a casual committee focused on potlucks instead of fines. Daniel's new orchard thrived, its fruit sweeter than ever, its roots sinking deep into soil reclaimed from ruin. He spent his days tending the trees, each one a tribute to his family. Elias's cherries, Thomas's apples, his own peaches. The anger faded, replaced by quiet pride. The neighbors stopped by often, trading stories over baskets of fruit, their gratitude a balm to old wounds. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Daniel sat on his porch with a glass of cider pressed from Big Red's successors. The lot next door glowed with life, a testament to resilience. Laura had tried to destroy him, but she'd only made him stronger. The best revenge wasn't the money or the lawsuit. It was this, a legacy reborn, thriving where she'd failed. "I didn't just win," he murmured, raising his glass to the trees. "I grew."